gamers, if you're new here, welcome to my channel, and if you're one of my subscribers, welcome back. Today I want to talk about contrast paint. So in a lot of my painting videos that I've done on the channel thus far, a lot of them have been speed painting videos where I heavily use contrast paints to reduce the amount of time that I need to spend on a miniature. As many people can probably relate to, having a full-time job and participating in miniature painting as a hobby, as adults, we just don't have the kind of time that maybe we had back when we were teenagers or when we were in university. And contrast paints are a great tool to help reduce the amount of time required to paint a miniature and still get a relatively quality result. However, not all contrast paints are created equal. So my current personal project that I'm working on, I have a big Age of Sigmar game coming up over the American Thanksgiving holiday, which gives me about 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to finish 2,000 points worth of orcs. Now I'm about halfway done. The orc painting videos that I did a couple months back tallied up to roughly just under 1,000 points. But now I'm painting that second 1,000 points to get me to the full 2K. And so, following in the same vein of trying to paint quickly in the evenings, and then I have the additional time sink of making videos and editing videos and all of that fun stuff. So I don't really have that much time to paint, and I'm actually kind of feeling a little bit of a time crunch on this project. So I went ahead and I used Orc Flesh contrast paint to try and speed up the painting on my Orc Brutes. And as you'll notice, and I'm sorry, my webcam isn't the greatest. We'll have some more detailed photos later. But these are not GW Orc Brutes. I'm using Artisan Guild Frost Metal Orcs that I 3D printed, and they look fantastic. Shout out to Artisan Guild. I will go ahead and put a link to their web store in the description box below. They have a Patreon where you can get a massive discount on the sets that they make. And if you subscribe to their Patreon, you also get a discount on past models that aren't available this month that they sell on their web store. Highly recommend them if you need fantasy miniatures for really anything, RPGs, Age of Sigmar, other fantasy games. They have a wide range at this point. They've been operating for a couple of years now, I think, and their minis are just fantastic. But the issue that I was running into when I was painting these, I had never used Orc Flesh before from the contrast line. And as careful as I was, using thin layers and everything, it's a heavily pigmented, more so than the rest of the contrast line, paint. And you will very quickly get staining that will appear as blots and blemishes on your flat surfaces, almost no matter how careful you are. So what I want to do today is show how you can correct that by using traditional layering and glazing relatively quickly and get your miniature looking ace without putting in too much time or effort. I do want to give credit where it's due. A lot of these concepts I actually learned from Duncan Rhodes, widely hailed as one of the masters of the miniature painting world at this point in history. And he has a really great video. If I can find it, I will go ahead and link it, where he once he severed from Games Workshop, having been a part of the creative team that created contrast paints, and then getting tons of hands-on time with it while he was at the company, he elucidated lots of details about contrast paint that Games Workshop themselves did not come out and present to the public. And as it's marketed as a beginner paint line, beginner friendly, I should say, they kind of did a disservice there. But a lot of the tips and tricks that I'm going to show today on how you can correct those blemishes, I learned from his video. So without further ado, let's get down to the paint table, and I'll show you what the problem is, and then I'll also show you how we fix it. Alright, so as you can see here, the Orc Flesh contrast paint, it's given us some really good shading on the miniature, but the flat areas of the skin are very, very patchy. Now, if you're super careful with your application of the paint, you can avoid this to a certain degree, but this is one of the more heavily pigmented paints that stain very easily, so it can be very difficult to avoid it completely. So now what we're going to do to fix that and get our skin actually looking great is first we're going to layer on some Warpstone Glow as a highlight, and then we're going to mix Warpstone Glow and Auric Flesh together as a second highlight for the most prominent raised parts of the flesh. And then after we're done with that application, we're going to go ahead and glaze over it to blend everything together. So let me get these on the palette, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Alright, so we've got our one mix and then one raw paint thinned down on the wet palette. So here is the pure Warpstone Glow, and then here is the mix of Warpstone Glow with Auric Flesh. And this is 2 parts Auric Flesh to 1 part Warpstone Glow. And now we're going to work wet, which essentially that means we're going to quickly apply Warpstone Glow where it needs to go, wash our brush off, and then apply the mix in a smaller section of that area while the base Warpstone Glow is still wet, to help us get some really nice blends. So what's that going to look like on the head here is we're going to go ahead and lay down this Warpstone Glow, and our paint is really nice and thin. And with this, you don't want to go into the recesses. We want that Orc Flesh contrast in the recesses. That's what's giving us our shading. And now here with the mix, we're going and getting the very top of the skull. And now once you get this down, you don't want to mess with it while it's drying. So when that first layer is drying, just give it time to do its thing and move on to another part of the miniature. So now we're going to do the legs here. And again, same concept. Want to go ahead, get a really nice smooth layer. If you find that your Warpstone Glow isn't quite covering up the patchiness in one coat, that's okay. Just let that dry and then move on to a different area and apply that first coat, and then you can come back and give it a second coat before you start with your final highlight layer. So I'm going to go ahead and crack on, and I'll come back and show you what it looks like once I've got the skin cleaned up with those initial couple of layers. Alright, so here we are after a few layers. So at the top of the head here, you can see how we've got the start of a blend, and there are still some harsh lines between the second highlight and the first highlight. But that's what we're going to smooth out now by mixing up a glaze. So before we do that though, you can also see here around the thighs, and then I did a little on this exposed arm in the back, and actually I missed that arm, so I will do that one on camera. But we're starting to get some volume to the arms. We've smoothed out a lot of those blemishes that were on the skin, and this glaze layer that we're about to do will just help unify everything together. And now this does require some patience. We're working with very, very thin paint, and you do need to let it dry between your layers. Now, because it's thin, it dries quick, but if you're hyper impatient, you may need to speed up the drying process. Some people like to use a hair dryer. Make sure it's on low setting. You don't want to like melt your mini. But like I said, these layers dry relatively quick. But you want to make sure that you don't disturb them while they're drying, because the paint's so thin that your brush will tear that layer right off. It's one of the downsides of working with acrylic paints, and why doing this sort of thing with oil paint is actually much, much easier because of the longer working time. But there we go. We've smoothed out that arm. And so now we're going to mix up our glaze. And now what we're going to use for this is our original orc flesh, but we're going to heavily dilute it with this transpirator. Now, if you only have Citadel products, you could use Lamia Medium. You can also buy Liquitex acrylic glaze medium, which I have a giant jug of, but I don't want to go run and grab it. I'll just put a picture of it up on the screen. But essentially, you just want pure acrylic medium that you can mix the orc flesh into to heavily dilute it without changing the properties of the paint. So now what we're going to do is get ourselves a brush full of orc flesh on our palette. And now the original GW product information for contrast paint warned people not to use it on a wet palette. That has since been debunked as not being necessary. So when mixing up this glaze, it will be helpful to use a wet palette. Now what we're going for is about 20% orc flesh and 80% transpirator. So let's start with 4 drops and then see what that looks like. And now whenever I'm mixing up glazes like this, I like to do a load test on my fingernail. Yeah, that's really nice and thin. You can see how very little color that's leaving on my nail, and how every stroke that I do adds more and more pigment, but you're still working with super fine layers that are super translucent, and that's about the consistency that we're going for. So now what we're going to do is load up our brush, and you want to get most of that off. You want your brush to be very lightly loaded. So if you guys can, here, let me help the camera focus. You guys can see my brush is just glistening, but it's not, dripping. That's about what you're going for. And you just want to rub this all over the areas that we had just highlighted. Again, same rules apply from the work that we were doing in the previous steps. Once you lay down a coat, you got to let that dry before you apply a second one, so just move on to a different area of the mini. And then the more coats that we apply, the smoother these transitions will be. And this will tie everything together from the recess shading all the way up through our multiple highlight layers. And while I'm doing this, I do want to point out that with those highlights, I only did a 2-stage highlight, mostly because I've got a lot of crap to paint for my upcoming Thanksgiving Age of Sigmar showdown in Pittsburgh. But you could take this as far as you want. So you could have mixed progressively lighter shades of your highlight tones and went ahead and kept highlighting smaller and smaller areas until you got a level of definition that you were happy with. Typically with a big project like this, I don't like to do more than 2 highlights, just because it's so time consuming. Alright, we're just about done with that first layer. And the head looks dry, so we can go ahead and do a second layer on the head. Before I start, you can kind of see how the area where there was a stark transition, it's starting to soften, and that'll happen with every layer that we give this. Those areas of transition will gradually weaken until they're barely noticeable by the naked eye. And so this is essentially just glazing. For a lot of new painters, they'll hear that term thrown around, and it can be a little intimidating. But this is literally all it is. Just taking a really, really thinned out paint. Some people like to thin with water. I like to thin with medium, just because it retains the properties of acting like a paint, but you still get that nice translucent color. So that was 2 layers. I think we'll go ahead and do 1 more. And now with this one, because I don't want to super darken down my highlights, I'm just going to focus on the transition points. So that I don't tone down my highlights too much. So like this patch right here on the thigh, I'm really just going to focus on that outside edge of it. These orcs that I'm painting, I'm using them as orc brutes, but they are frost metal orcs from the Artisan Guild that I 3D printed. I'll go ahead and post some links to the artist shop if anybody's interested in their stuff. They make really great fantasy miniatures. But there we are. I think that is, we'll call it good there. So let me try and get closer up to the camera. You can see we really smoothed out the skin from where we were in the beginning. And actually, I've got 10 of these next to me, so I can grab another example. So here's one where we haven't done any smoothing. And then compare that to this one. So yeah, it doesn't take a long time, and it can make a big difference in the finish of your miniatures. I hope that was helpful, gang. Alright, so there you have it. I hope everyone was able to see how easy it really is to go ahead and correct blemishes with your contrast paint layers. And typically with a miniature painting project, you were going to do highlights anyway, but doing them in this way allows you to save time by still using contrast paint, but correct those small blemishes as you go without spending too much additional time. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and pop them down in the comment section below. I do read all of my comments at this point, and I try to reply back to people as soon as I can. Stay tuned if you're into Age of Sigmar and fantasy miniatures. I will be painting more of my Orc War clans on the channel in the upcoming weeks, and they might not be full-blown painting videos, because it is nice to still be able to paint miniatures without having to worry about filming everything. But as I come across techniques that I feel might be helpful to a wider audience, I will take the time to film those and get those out. And also coming out in the future, I've got, I want to say, 5 Taiga creatures that I need to paint for Infinity Defiance. And then once those are done, I'll go ahead and film Mission 2 of the Infinity Defiance core campaign and get that video out before Thanksgiving. So look forward to that in the upcoming weeks. But I'm going to go ahead and sign out for now. Keep slaying the Grey Hobby Warriors, and I'll see you in the next video.